Este es un programa VTR.
Estamos en tu ciudad, miramos tu realidad. Panorama Chile, la voz de las regiones.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Bienvenidos a Panorama Chile. Hoy queremos hablar con una experta en los temas de descentralización y desarrollo territorial, de gobernanza, que viene desde Toronto. Ella se llama Enid Slack, directora del Instituto Municipal de Finanzas y Gobernanza de la Universidad de Toronto. Welcome to Panorama Chile, Enid.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Is well pronounced, Enid?
Enid.
Enid, okay. I want to start with this subject that you recently talked about. Is possible metropolitan governance in a centralized country?
Well, yes, I think it is. I know Chile is talking about going through decentralization and metropolitan governance at the same time. And I think those are two processes that are separate, but they are related. So if a central government is thinking about decentralizing, a metropolitan governance structure gives them a good opportunity to devolve some of those responsibilities that are normally central to the local level through the metropolitan structure.
Yeah, as you can see in the Colombian example and I don't know, Korea example, this is not an easy process. And usually it's not like a normal process. It is sometimes a part grows and the other one starts to keep very tiny. So right now we are just in the middle of that process. We don't choose who's going to represent us. That's a decision from the central government. So what do you think is the minimum that we need to decide from the territory?
You know, when we talk about decentralization, we talk about the reasons for doing it. And the reasons are that local governments are closer to the people.
Yes.
That they're serving, and so they can be more accountable and more responsive to local needs. And so that's a good reason for decentralization. When local governments raise their own revenues, they tend to be more accountable for the revenues they're raising. And so you want local governments to provide some services, to make some decisions on behalf of local residents because they are closer to them and know better what they are interested in having. And that might be transportation, it might be garbage collection, it might be other services that can be provided by local governments.
Have you seen in the world some examples of good processes of decentralization that give us like a result, metropolitan governance?
Well, the United Kingdom is one of the examples that I talked about, which is right now doing a decentralization and a metropolitan governance process at the same time. And they are related, but they are separate processes. So they're doing devolution deals with some of the cities in the UK, where the cities can come to the central government and say, we want to do economic development, we want to do transportation, we may want to do some social services. These are the things we would like to do, and we need the resources to do them. And so they strike a deal. They're called devolution deals between these authorities and the central government. But they're doing it through a metropolitan governance model. So Manchester, for example, has the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. They have put together what I would call a two-tier system. They put together a metropolitan government to look at the metropolitan-wide issues, such as transportation and land use planning, but they have kept the local governments in place to do the local functions, things that are more community-related. So you've got the two tiers, the metropolitan-wide tier, and then you have the lower tiers. And so they've constructed this combined authority, a metropolitan government, to take on the responsibilities that are being devolved from the central government. So again, two different processes, but linked together.
I don't know if in England it's the same, but here it's not the same to be a poor neighbor or a big one, a rich one. and it usually it has a result that is terrible because the rich one has more power than the other in front of the metropolitan system, you know. How do they deal with this difference?
Well, part of creating the metropolitan structure is to share the costs. And so I can give the example of our city of Toronto, which was a metropolitan government with 6 lower tiers. And some of those lower tiers were richer than other lower tiers, and they had better services and lower tax rates. When they came together as one unit, everybody paid the same tax rates and got pretty similar services. So there was a redistribution that went on from the richer municipalities to the poorer municipalities. Not everybody likes that, but it was put together as a single structure in part to do that redistribution.
Who decided that system? Because the people that is not really happy with this
Right.
sharing model, who has to decide this system?
Well, in that case, it was, we're in a federal country, not
Yeah,
like
yeah,
Chile, which is a unitary country. So that would have been the responsibility of the provincial government. And the provincial government imposed it. It passed legislation to create one city of Toronto. It was not a popular decision.
Yeah. Do you think that's possible? Because here there is a huge discussion about if you are raised and you have lived 200 years, we are a very young country, in a centralized country, it's very difficult for you to think decentralized in a decentralized way, you know, to take those decisions, to be more generous with other people, especially in this country that has grown by this idea of save myself, you know, it's very difficult. So do you think that a centralized mind can get to that common solution?
Yes, I think it can. I think it can. And, you know, I talked earlier this morning about, you know, you can't impose, it's not a great idea to impose a metropolitan government structure. So in some country we've seen voluntary cooperation. I mean, I think what people do understand is they want great services. And in order to get great services, we sometimes have to make the decision making a little bit different. And so, you know, if we're coming into a city and there's a lot of traffic congestion, how do we fix that? And we may not be able to fix it when we have 30 different local governments, each making decisions about transportation. We need to fix that by thinking about it on a regional basis, with everybody involved. We need to understand that transportation and land use planning to go together. We can't put people in housing developments here if all the transportation infrastructure is over there. We need to think about that on a regional basis. So I think the way to get at it is I think people do understand that they want good services and they want a good quality of life. And sometimes that means giving up some things. It may mean higher taxes. It may mean sharing the costs with other places. But at the end of the day, if we can show that the services are better, the decision making is better, I think people will understand that.
Do you think that the country, like to be an unitary country or a federal, is something important to have these solutions for metropolitan governance? Do you think that there is an...
So I think the unitary versus federal is a big question. And I think if we focus on that, we'll waste a lot of time. I mean, this is a unitary country, so let's see if we can get some metropolitan governance structures within the unitary system. It has been done in other places. You know, I've talked about the United Kingdom. There are other examples of where metropolitan governance structures have been set up in a unitary country. So I would focus on setting up those metropolitan structures rather than on whether we're unitary or federal.
Yeah, my question was because we are in that moment where we have lots of ghosts everywhere. Like there's a lot of danger processes related with giving people more power or decisions in one way of thought, and the other one says, well, there's the only way to be developed. What do you think? Because I don't want to change the model of my country. I'm totally sure that I can't, but I would like to find a way of have real expectations of something we really can get from this process, you know?
Well, again, I go back to if we can improve services and decision making, share the costs more fairly, I think that would be better. If we elect our municipal governments, then we have the opportunity to say, well, we don't like what you did, and we won't elect you next time. So there is a way of saying, if this doesn't work, we'll vote for someone else next time.
What else? We need to elect people, but also what else? You said a lot of things we need for
Right.
this process to work. So,
well, we need both a top-down and a bottom-up approach. So the central government needs to bring the legislation in place, the institutional structures in place to make it happen. You wouldn't want to see a case where the central government is discouraging the creation of metropolitan governments. We'd want them to encourage it. But at the same time as that top-down approach is needed, you need a bottom-up approach. You need the local governments and the people to come together to say, we really want something at the metropolitan level. I can give you the case of the United Kingdom. Back in the 80s, when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, she got rid of the Greater London Council. So there was a system of two tiers: local boroughs, in their case, and a Greater London Council that did some of the metropolitan-wide decision-making. She got rid of the Greater London Council. So in the end, the local boroughs had to pick up a lot of responsibilities, and the central government had to pick up a lot of responsibilities, because again, it was a unitary system. The people came forward, the business community came forward and said, we need that metropolitan tier, particularly for economic development, for growth. We need that metropolitan tier back. And so a number of years later, new Prime Minister, they created the Greater London Authority. So that was a bottom-up approach that said, we need that metropolitan level of government. So you need top-down, the institutions, the legislation in place to encourage metropolitan governance, but at the same time you need that bottom-up interest in having it created.
Enid, we're going to make a little pause and we're going to continue with this interview.
Okay.
Vamos a hacer una pausa y volvemos. Volvemos con esta conversación con Enid Slack sobre descentralización, gobernanza territorial y cómo construir un nuevo modelo en torno a estos enormes temas y desafíos que tenemos como país en estas materias. Enid, I want to talk about the example you were giving recently. The people the people said okay to this process. We are right now in a world that really has huge changes to make in an environmental way, in a civil way. Do you think that this world needs more governance than the past world?
Do we need more governance? I don't know the answer to that, but I think what's happening with changing demographics, with the climate change, all speaks toward the need for metropolitan governance, really, because many of these issues go beyond those local government boundaries. They're metropolitan-wide issues. I talked this morning a little bit about solid waste management. Where do we put the garbage disposal sites? We have to think about that on a metropolitan basis. What do we do with storm drains? If we have a big storm and there's flooding and one municipality is not doing their job in terms of maintaining their storm drains, that's going to affect everybody else in the area, in the metropolitan area, who are going to experience flooding. So how do we make these decisions on a metropolitan basis to address these problems? So I think a lot of what's going on in the world speaks to the need for more metropolitan decision making and service delivery.
You start your presentation with the question, why metropolitan governance matters? Why?
Okay. I also started by saying people don't really know what metropolitan governance is or why it matters, so we should be talking about it. It matters for service delivery, and I just gave a couple of examples, storm drains or where to put a garbage disposal site. We've talked about transportation and land use planning. It also matters for how costs are shared within a metropolitan area. In a lot of metropolitan areas you have a large central city and some suburbs around. And a lot of people live in the suburbs, they come to work in the central city, they use the services in the central city, and then they go back to the suburbs at night and they pay taxes there. So how do we get those services in the central city that everybody needs when a lot of the people using them aren't paying for them? Again, if we have some metropolitan structure, we can share those costs fairly between the city and the suburbs, so everybody is paying for those services. So it matters for the costs of services being shared fairly, it matters for service delivery, it matters for getting consensus on what we're going to do in the metropolitan area. Where are we going to put the services? What businesses are we going to attract to the region? How do we get consensus on that among, if you've got 30 municipalities, it's pretty hard to talk to everybody and get some agreement. So there are a lot of reasons why metropolitan governance matters.
Right now we have a discussion because the suburbs usually they don't get the benefits of almost nothing. Like the taxes are paid in the central parts always, and including the regions, they leave the bad part of the progress. They have the companies in their territories, but those companies pay the taxes here in the main city, So do you think that what's a good model to distribute taxes to make a more fair place to live?
Well, I think it's really important that we match the revenues we collect with the expenditures we're making. And so if I come into the city and use transit, I obviously pay a user fee for that transit, but that doesn't cover the whole cost. So who's subsidizing that? Should it be the people in the central city, or should the suburbs where people are making use of that transit system also pay for it? So, partly you can use user fees, but I think taxes have to account for the services that people are using. If you have a metropolitan government structure and it levies taxes for the metropolitan area, then everybody, in the cities and the suburbs, are paying for the costs of those services. We're matching who's benefiting with who's paying.
In your presentation, you talk about Barcelona.
Yes.
What do you think is a good example to take from that city?
Barcelona is a very interesting example, and Barcelona is a large city. It had 30 plus municipalities, around 36 municipalities in the metropolitan area. And they joined together to do water, to do transportation. They had a loose affiliation of municipalities. Each of those structures had a different number of municipalities in them. And so they were cooperating, but then among themselves on specific things like transportation or water. What they did in 2010 was pass legislation to create a metropolitan government. So they kept the 36 lower tiers to deliver local services, to be responsible and responsive to local constituents. But they have a metropolitan government which looks at the water, the transportation, and coordination of services. It's a nice model because it allows the metropolitan government to think as a region, to coordinate those services that are truly region-wide, but at the same time to leave local parks and recreation services, things that are very local, to the lower tiers.
What do you think is a good timing to plan today, that everything is changing so fast and that we are needing all the time different solutions? Because we have the problem of short-term planning. Chile is all the time suffering of that. But what's the long-term proper planning model or timing, do you think?
Well, I can't give you an exact number of years. I think you have to start thinking in terms of what do you want to do in your metropolitan areas? And what do the people in those metropolitan areas want to do? And then I think the central government needs to set up a process. And we've seen these processes in the United Kingdom, in other countries, where metropolitan areas, the municipalities come together with a plan.
And when you see examples around the world like Barcelona, they started in 2010, you say?
Well, they brought in the two-tier structure in 2010, but that was based on an already existing system of thinking metropolitan on some specific services.
So we might plan to have a plan for 20 years? Like if we want to think about Región Metropolitana, which is the place where Santiago is, how long do you need to change the face of a metropolitan area?
It's really hard to answer that. It depends on your starting point. I mean, how much metropolitan cooperation do you have now? If you have a lot of metropolitan cooperation, it's going to be easier.
We don't.
Then it'll take longer. I mean, I think of Greater Manchester, where they created a combined authority in Greater Manchester. They had a history of working together on economic development issues, on other issues. It was easy to bring them together to form this metropolitan structure. So it may take longer if you haven't done that.
Here we have, it depends on the person that is representing us, but we have periods of 4 years, 8 years, it depends on who, But this council, like the big one with the metropolitan view, has a plan that must be respected. I mean, when you do a plan for 20 years, there's some institutional tool to make the people respect the previous decisions. I don't know if I'm clear. Like, how can you be sure that your decisions today are going to be respected in the future for the next?
Well, that's difficult. Governments change and legislation change and regulations change.
But Latin America is
it's true everywhere. It is true everywhere. A new government may come in with a different view, and I think you just have to build the basis for a metropolitan structure and convince people that this is an important thing to do, and hopefully that will continue by convincing new governments, that will continue to happen. And
is a common thing this practice of planned metropoli around the world? These examples you gave are very specific, but do you think it's something that is happening, that is growing around the world, the need of this and the people getting together to make a big plan for their cities?
Well, what I think is happening around the world, and I'm finding this more and more in my work, is everybody's talking about metropolitan governance. The need for something to deal with issues that cross municipal boundaries.
Is that new?
It's increasing. It's not new, but it's increasing in importance as the world changes. The things we talked about before, like climate change, is making it more urgent to do something. What's being done really varies around the world. Some people are doing more than others. Some countries are doing more than others. But everybody is concerned about how to deal with transportation and land use planning, how to deal with environmental issues, how to deal with social issues. As we're urbanizing very quickly. The world is very largely urban at this point. That's going to continue to happen. These problems like air pollution and traffic congestion, inequality, these are growing, and so people are understanding the need to deal with these issues on a metropolitan-wide basis. So I think we're going to see a lot more about metropolitan governance in the coming years.
And do you think that digital world has a place to has a role here in this process? I mean, the digital society.
Of course it does. Of course it does, and we have to think about that. With the apps and online applications, it makes local governments more responsive and accountable because people can get to them faster. I think it has some really good aspects to it.
Enid, thank you very much for being in Panorama Chile talking with us.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Hasta aquí llegamos con esta conversación. Tratamos de traer algunos ejemplos internacionales que nos cuenten qué podemos hacer aquí, qué buenas ideas se pueden implementar de forma más rápida en un proceso que ha tardado tanto en este país. Así que nos encontramos otra vez en Panorama Chile.
VTR presentó
Estamos en tu ciudad, miramos tu realidad. Panorama Chile, la voz de las regiones.